When I first bought my house, I was just excited to finally have a place to call my own. I had spent years renting cramped apartments, where my tools, gardening supplies, and extra stuff had to be jammed into closets or shoved under my bed. So the first thing I did when I moved into my new place was build a shed. Nothing fancy. Just a simple wooden structure in the backyard where I could store my lawnmower, my old camping gear, and the mountain of boxes that still hadn't found a home inside the house. To me, it was practical. To the HOA, apparently, it was an eyesore. I'll never forget the day I got the first letter. I opened my mailbox to find an official-looking envelope with the HOA's logo printed at the top. Inside was a notice of violation. It said my shed was unsightly and detracted from the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. They gave me 30 days to remove it or face daily fines. 30 days for a structure that was fully on my property, behind my house, not blocking anyone's view, and not even visible from the street unless you craned your neck over the fence. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake. I even called the HOA office to clarify. The woman on the phone, in the most condescending tone imaginable, told me, "The shed simply does not meet the community's standards. It's too ugly." That word stuck with Mugly, as if I had painted it neon green with graffiti on the side. It was just plain wood, clean and functional. I was angry, but more than that, I was baffled. How could they tell me what I could and couldn't build in my own backyard? I decided to attend the next HOA meeting to get some answers. When I showed up, the room was full of neighbors sitting in folding chairs. At the front was the HOA president, a sharp-looking woman in her late 50s with a permanent scowl. Her name was Linda, and she wasted no time in addressing me when I brought up my shed. "Your shed is in violation of our aesthetic guidelines," she said, tapping a stack of papers in front of her. "It doesn't match the neighborhood style. It brings down property values." I asked her to show me the specific rule I had broken. She flipped through her binder, but never found anything that said sheds were outright banned. Instead, she said, "The rule is about maintaining harmony, and your shed doesn't harmonize." People in the room started whispering. Some looked sympathetic, others avoided eye contact. That was my first real taste of how the HOA operated, not by strict rules, but by vague interpretations that gave them power over anyone they wanted to control. That night, I went home more determined than ever. If they wanted to call my shed ugly, fine. But I wasn't about to let them bully me into tearing it down. I started digging through the HOA bylaws myself. What I found was interesting. While they had guidelines about structures visible from the street, they had almost nothing about secondary dwelling units or guest structures. In fact, there was a clause that allowed for guest accommodations so long as they met city code. That gave me an idea. Instead of tearing the shed down, what if I transformed it? What if I took their insult that it was ugly and turned it into something undeniably beautiful? Something they couldn't argue against because it would be perfectly legal and even desirable. The idea took root in my mind and wouldn't let go. I started sketching plans, watching videos on tiny house conversions, and pricing out materials. My shed wasn't huge, but it was big enough to reimagine as a modern tiny guest house. Something sleek, stylish, and practical. Something that would make the HOA regret ever coming after me. Before I committed, though, I wanted to make sure I wasn't walking into a trap. I contacted the city building department, explained what I wanted to do, and asked what permits I would need. The guy on the phone chuckled and said, "Honestly, as long as it's up to code and you're not adding plumbing, you're good to go." That was all I needed to hear. The next weekend, I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. What started as an act of defiance quickly became a passion project. I stripped the shed down to its frame, reinforced the walls, and added insulation. I installed new windows with black trim, a sleek sliding glass door, and a tiny porch with a modern railing. Inside, I added wood paneling, recessed lighting, and a loft bed. I even designed a fold-out desk and a mini kitchenette with a sink and fridge. As the weeks passed, my backyard turned into a construction zone. Neighbors would stop by to peek over the fence and ask what I was building. When I told them I was turning the shed into a tiny guest house, most of them were impressed. One neighbor said, "That's genius." My in-laws would love something like that, but not everyone was supportive. Linda, the HOA president, started coming by more often. She would stand on the sidewalk, arms crossed, glaring at me as if she could stop me with her stare alone. A couple of times, she even shouted over the fence, "You know that's not going to fly with the HOA." I ignored her, because by then, I knew something she didn't tie was within my rights. And I wasn't just building a guest house, I was building a statement. Every nail I hammered, every piece of wood I cut, it all felt like reclaiming power. This wasn't just about a shed anymore. It was about showing the HOA they couldn't control every detail of my life. And when the final touches went in the cedar siding, the matte black accents, the string lights over the porch, I stood back and looked at what I had created. It wasn't just a shed. It was a tiny modern home that looked like it belonged in an architecture magazine. That's when I knew the real battle was about to begin. Because if Linda thought my old shed was ugly, she was going to absolutely lose her mind when she saw what I had turned it into. The morning after I finished the guest house, I stepped outside with my coffee and just admired it. Sunlight hit the cedar siding, making it glow golden. The black-trimmed windows reflected the sky like glassy mirrors. It didn't look like a shed anymore, looked like something straight out of a design magazine. Clean, minimal, and intentional. But I knew what was coming. Sure enough, by that afternoon, I had another envelope in my mailbox. Another notice of violation. Only this time, it wasn't about a shed. The letter claimed I had constructed an unauthorized secondary dwelling. They accused me of breaking HOA rules and warned me I'd face $100 a day fines if I didn't remove the structure. I laughed. Out loud. Because here's the thing. They thought they had me, but they didn't. This wasn't a shed anymore, which a guest house. And it fell under city codes for accessory dwelling units. The HOA might have aesthetic guidelines, but they couldn't override actual city ordinances. I had done my homework. Everything I built was legal. So instead of panicking, I wrote them a letter back. Short and to the point. Dear HOA, the structure in my backyard meets all city codes as an accessory dwelling unit. It does not violate any specific bylaw in your covenant. Therefore, I will not be removing it. Sincerely, me. I dropped it off in their office personally, smiling at the receptionist who gave me a look like I had just handed her a bomb. That week, word started spreading around the neighborhood. People who hadn't even talked to me before were suddenly curious. Some came over to ask if they could see inside. I decided, why not? I gave tours. I showed them the loft bed, the fold-out desk, the little porch. Almost everyone who stepped inside said the same thing. This is incredible. Why would the HOA fight this? That was the question on everyone's mind. It didn't take long before the whispers reached me. Other neighbors had their own grievances with the HOA. They were tired of the nitpicking. The endless fines, the constant harassment over things like mailbox colors and lawn heights. My guest house had become more than just a projectee, was a symbol of standing up to them. Of course, Linda the president wasn't happy about that. She showed up at my door one evening, clipboard in hand. "We need to talk," she said, in that tight-lipped way that really meant she was about to lecture me. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "What's the problem now, Linda?" "The problem," she said, pointing toward the guest house, "is that monstrosity. You can call it whatever you want, but it doesn't belong in this neighborhood. You think you're clever, but you're undermining everything this HOA stands for." I couldn't help but smirk. If by undermining you mean following the law and building something beautiful on my own property, then yeah, I guess I am." Her face turned red. "We will take you to court if we have to." "Good luck with that," I told her, "because I've already checked with the city. And trust me, Linda, you don't want to pick that fight." She stormed off, muttering under her breath, and that's when I realized this wasn't just about my guest house anymore. It was about control. The HOA thrived on intimidation. If they lost to me, it would show everyone else that they weren't as powerful as they wanted to seem, and I wasn't planning to let them win. The next weekend, I decided to take things up a notch. I listed the guest house on a short-term rental site just for fun, just to see what would happen. Within hours, I had bookings. People wanted to stay there. Strangers messaged me saying, "This is gorgeous. What a perfect tiny home getaway." When the first guests arrived, my neighbors saw cars pulling into my driveway, people unloading weekend bags, laughing on the little porch under the string lights. It was like something out of a lifestyle ad. And that's when I knew this guest house wasn't just going to annoy the HOA, it was going to thrive. What I didn't know yet, though, was how far Linda and the board were willing to go to shut me down. Because if I thought a few angry letters were bad, the next move they made was something I never saw coming. The letter came certified this time. That alone told me they were serious. When I opened it, my stomach twisted not because I was scared, but because I couldn't believe how far they were reaching. The HOA board had scheduled a special hearing about my property. According to the letter, they were accusing me of operating a commercial business within the neighborhood because of the short-term rental. They claimed it violated community rules about maintaining the residential character of the subdivision. I laughed when I read it. They were so desperate to control me, they were bending their own rules. I wasn't running a business. I was just renting out my legal guest house the same way people rent out rooms or basements. But here's the kicker. I already knew something they didn't. A month earlier, while combing through old records, I'd found something fascinating. A handful of the board members, including Linda herself, had been caught violating their own rules in the past. One had built a backyard deck without approval. Another had an unapproved satellite dish. And Linda. She had converted part of her garage into a home office that technically counted as a structural change, with no approval on file. I wasn't planning on using it. But when they escalated things with this bogus hearing, I decided maybe it was time. The night of the meeting, I walked into the clubhouse and saw the board seated at their long table. Papers stacked neatly, smug expressions ready to tear me apart. A few neighbors had come to watch, curious to see what would happen. Linda started in immediately. "This hearing is to address the blatant violations by Mr. Carter, who has been operating a short-term rental property without HOA authorization. This disrupts the character of our neighborhood and sets a dangerous precedent." I raised my hand casually. "Mind if I respond?" "Briefly," she said. I stood up, holding a folder I'd brought with me. "First off, the structure in my backyard is legal under city ordinances. It's classified as an accessory dwelling unit, which I had confirmed directly with the zoning office. Second, the HOA's bylaws don't prohibit short-term rentals. They never have. You can comb through every page and you won't find a word against it." Linda's face tightened. She opened her mouth, but I wasn't done. "And third," I pulled a few papers from the folder. "Before you accuse me of violating rules, maybe you should take a look at some violations within your own board." Gasps echoed around the room as I read them off one by one. The deck, the satellite dish, and then Linda's garage conversion. "You've all broken your own rules," I said, holding up the papers. "So maybe, instead of targeting me, you should take a look in the mirror. Unless, of course, you plan to fine yourselves." The room went dead silent. One neighbor in the back chuckled. Another muttered, "He's got a point." Linda slammed her gavel so hard it echoed. "That's enough. This meeting is adjourned." She stood and stormed out, her face red as fire. The other board members scrambled after her, whispering furiously. I walked out calm, collected, and maybe even a little smug. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Because when you embarrass people who thrive on control, they don't just give up. They fight harder. And sure enough, the very next day, I found something taped to my front door that made my blood boil. It wasn't a violation this time. It was a threat. The fallout from that community post spread faster than I imagined. For years, Linda and her board had ruled by fear, but now their mask was slipping. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact with me when walking past my property were suddenly waving, stopping for small talk, even asking if they could see the guest house for themselves. I welcomed them in, and every person who stepped inside was blown away. One neighbor, a retired contractor, shook his head and said, "This is craftsmanship. They should be proud to have this in the neighborhood, not trying to tear it down." Word spread. Within a week, people were booking the guest house for visiting relatives. It wasn't just a side project anymore, it was a part of the community. Families who couldn't fit all their relatives during holidays rented it out. Out-of-town friends of neighbors stayed there instead of at overpriced hotels. My little project had become something people relied on. That, of course, only made Linda angrier. The board called an emergency HOA meeting, claiming I was operating a business in violation of neighborhood rules. I showed up with a binder full of receipts, legal documents, and city permits. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, standing at the front of the crowded room, "what I do with my property is legal. This shed was transformed into a permitted guest house, and the occasional rental is not prohibited under state law. If the HOA believes otherwise, suggest you consult a real attorney instead of bullying your neighbors." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Several people clapped before Linda banged her gavel, her face red with fury. "This is not a hotel zone," she barked. "And yet," I replied calmly, "many of you here have had your family or friends stay in my guest house. Did it hurt anyone? Or did it actually benefit the neighborhood?" Heads nodded. The room wasn't on her side anymore. The board tried to push a vote to shut me down, but the crowd was restless. Someone stood up and said, "Enough is enough. We're tired of these power games." Others agreed loudly. The meeting dissolved into chaos, and Linda stormed out, humiliated. The next day, I found out why she'd been fighting me so hard. A neighbor slipped me a copy of a public zoning record they'd dug up. Linda's own home had an unpermitted extension. A sunroom she had built years ago, without approval, that technically violated HOA standards. The hypocrisy was staggering. I had been attacked for a shed-turned guest house. Yet the president of the HOA herself had been living with an unapproved addition for years. That was the crack I needed. The balance of power had shifted, and for the first time, Linda wasn't the one holding the gavel. She was the one about to be judged. Once I had proof of Linda's hypocrisy, everything changed. I didn't even have to dig too hard. Her unapproved sunroom was public record, sitting there for anyone to see. While she was threatening me with fines and lawsuits, she herself had been violating HOA bylaws for years. I didn't go in guns blazing. I wanted this to play out the right way. So, at the next HOA meeting, I walked in calmly with a stack of papers under my arm. The room was packed again. Word had spread about the last showdown, and now everyone wanted to see the fireworks. Linda started in immediately, pounding her gavel and declaring, "We must revisit the issue of the illegal guest house." I raised my hand. "Before we do that," I said, my voice carrying across the room, "I think the community deserves full transparency. I've been accused of violating HOA rules. But I'd like to present evidence that the HOA president herself has been living in violation for over a decade. I handed copies of the zoning record to the board members and a few neighbors sitting close by. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people read the documents. That sunroom of yours, Linda, I continued, was never approved. No permits. No compliance. Yet here you are, calling my guest house an eyesore while you've been living in an unpermitted addition the entire time. The room exploded. People shouted. Some laughed. A couple of Linda's loyalists tried to defend her, but most of the crowd wasn't having it. For years, she had lorded over the community, handing out fines and threatening homeowners, and now her own secret was laid bare. Linda's face went pale. She stammered something about oversight and grandfathering, but no one believed her. By the end of the meeting, the board had no choice but to schedule a vote of no confidence. Within 2 weeks, Linda was removed as HOA president, and me. Not only was my guest house left alone, the new board made up of more reasonable neighbors levery praised me for improving the property. They even asked if I'd be willing to share my renovation process with others who wanted to upgrade their homes. I went from being the villain of the HOA to the guy people came to for advice. The tiny guest house became a symbol in the neighborhood, not just of creativity, but of standing up to bullies. Families continued to use it for visiting guests, and neighbors often gathered around the fire pit for small get-togethers. Linda, on the other hand, ended up selling her house a few months later. Her reputation was ruined, and she could no longer strong-arm anyone into silence. In the end, what started as a shed they called too ugly became the very thing that exposed the hypocrisy of the HOA president. And it taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Sometimes the best way to fight back isn't to tear down, but to build something better, stronger, and undeniable. And that's how a so-called ugly shed turned into the project that brought down an HOA president. What they meant as an insult, I turned into an opportunity, not just for myself, but for the whole neighborhood. Linda thought she could bully me into backing down, but in the end, it was her own hypocrisy that cost her everything. If there's one lesson here, it's this. When people try to tear you down, build higher. Stand firm, get creative, and never let someone else's bitterness define what you can achieve. After all, sometimes the best revenge isn't payback, it's progress.